Thank you to Bob Glushko and organizers of this conference. So my name is Shari Liu, and today I'm going to tell you about my work for my PhD thesis on the nature and origins of intuitive psychology in human infants. So look at this picture and ask yourself, what's here? Well, we can easily identify the people and the things in this scene, but we understand a lot more. We can answer questions like, what does this person want? How hard are they trying? And will they get what they were aiming for in the end? So the point of this example is to say that we look at scenes like this and we invoke both knowledge about the psychological world of this person with their goals and intentions in mind, and we also see them as a physical body acting in a physical world. So this is not just kind of the motivating example of the talk, but also depicts the population I study, that is human infants. So where does this knowledge come from, and how does it grow in infant minds? So my research stands on the shoulders of many previous studies showing that infants are sensitive to many aspects of agents' actions. So I don't have time to get into all of it here, but infants are sensitive to things like the physical properties of agents, their goals, the cost of their actions, their perceptual states, and their causal powers. But the point of bringing these examples is that my research asks whether these are separate individual abilities in infants or whether these constitute rich abstract knowledge about people's bodies and minds and the physical world. So this work is deeply inspired by computational work in this area that have offered formal proposals of what this knowledge could look like, specifically including variables like cost and reward, that abstract away from individual things we've seen and done and that trade off in precise ways and allow us to work backwards from the actions we observe to the mental states that cause them. So in my PhD, I tested the proposal that infants have something like an early intuitive theory of agents and actions with the properties described here. So I'll present three pieces of evidence for this proposal. First, that infants represent quantitative variables like the cost of other people's actions, that they use these variables to infer new information like what people prefer, and that these abilities go beyond infant-specific experiences. Okay, first, do babies have graded representations of cost? That is, can babies represent that one action is costlier than another? Well, many studies have tested this, so just to quickly go through this, typically babies come into the lab, they see movies of people or characters, in this case, this little red guy jumping over an obstacle towards the goal, and they see this over and over again, and their looking times decrease. And then at test, the barrier goes away, and kids see the agent move exactly the same way it did before, or on a straight path. And the finding is that if infants see the agent jump, even though it doesn't have to anymore, they'll look longer at that action, even though it follows exactly the same path as the previous phase of the experiment, and they'll prefer to look longer at that action than an entirely new action that's nevertheless efficient, given the change in the physical constraints of this agent. So we wanted to know, can infants detect a subtler way of being inefficient? So not just that the agent is jumping when it doesn't need to, but that it's failing to minimize cost when it does. So we ran a very similar experiment, except that at test, babies saw a new low barrier and two jumps, one that is less efficient than the other, and the key prediction is that if infants can represent relative cost, they'll look longer at the high jump. So the experimental design is on the left, and now I'll show you a box plot of the results. So we have looking time in seconds on the y-axis, and each line across these boxes is data from a single participant, and in red are the mean and within subjects 95% confidence intervals around that mean. And above the plots are beta coefficients that express effect sizes in standard deviation units. Okay, so in this experiment, we found that babies noticed when an agent was inefficient by failing to conform the height of the jump to the height of the new barrier and looked longer at that action than an entirely new path that was efficient. So in two other experiments, we showed that this effect is not explained by preferences for higher or faster jumping, because if you move the barrier out of the way, the effect goes away, and it's also not explained by learning that the agent jumps just high enough to clear the barrier, because if you pair the habituation events from this experiment with the test events from this experiment, that is at test now, is the first time the barrier blocks the agent, babies still look longer at the inefficient high jump in this case. So just to sum up, these experiments provide evidence that infants have graded representations of action cost that they expect other people to minimize. So next, I'll show you that older infants, older than 6 months at around 10 months, not only represent the graded costs of people's actions, but use that to infer hidden causes like people's preferences. So here's part 1 of the study, where babies are going to see this red guy in the middle do costlier actions for one of these goals than the other. So specifically, they see the red guy being willing to jump a barrier for the blue guy, but refuse a jump of the same height for the yellow guy. And this is actually just a subset of the events. Specifically, they see the red guy's willing to jump a little barrier for yellow, but not a medium for yellow, and a medium for blue, but not a tall barrier for blue. So we're trying to equate for the number of times that the agent accepts and refuses, and only manipulating the costs that they're willing to take towards each of these goals. Then we tested whether infants can learn the agent's preference. So we did this by asking them, if the agent could choose one of these goals, which one would he choose? And we showed babies both outcomes. The agent choosing the goal it was willing to work hard for, and the goal that he was not willing to work so hard for. And the argument, right, is that in order to infer someone's preference from the amount of effort that they put into their goals, infants need to reason about cost and reward together. So here are the findings. Infants look longer at the lower value action when the agent was willing to do costly things for one goal and then chose against that goal afterwards during test. After this, we ran 2 further experiments manipulating action cost in other ways. So in experiment 2, cost was the angle of an inclined plane that the agent climbs or refuses to climb. And in experiment 3, cost is the width of a gap that the agent jumps or isn't willing to jump. So across the 3 experiments, we tried to control for as many past variables as possible. So vertical motion, horizontal motion, time and speed and path length, and we tried to make it such that none of these features uniquely predicted the cost of actions across all experiments. And we found that in every case, infants on average look longer when someone does high-cost actions for a goal and then decides against choosing that goal later. We also built a set of probabilistic generative models, and we showed that indeed, we need integrated representations of cost and reward, and rich notions of cost and reward beyond just heuristics to explain these results and the results from previous work. So just to sum up, I think the work in this part of the talk provides evidence that infants have what constitutes an early intuitive theory of other people's actions. That is, it includes quantitative variables and trade-offs amongst them that allows infants to infer why things happen the way they did and to use these hidden causes to make predictions about what's going to happen next. And it's also interesting to note that this knowledge isn't restricted to people and actions that infants see every day. So in this way, infants are going beyond the particulars of their experiences when reasoning about these scenes. And indeed, in the previous 2 sets of studies, babies seem to reason about characters that look nothing like real people, doing actions that they themselves can't do. So in the next part, we study how babies respond to real human actors, but at an age where they can't even do simple things like reaching for objects. And that, we think, provides a really strong test of whether babies can go beyond their specific experiences to reason about other people's actions. So reaching is the action that we'll be talking about here. So reaching is a really common human action. So it feels trivial for us, for most of us, but it's really complicated. There's lots of ways that hands can interact with objects. So no wonder it takes 4 to 5 months for babies to successfully reach for and grasp objects, and even longer to do something like what this actress is doing here, reaching over an obstacle in order to get to an object. So in this work, we asked, what happens if you take 3-month-old babies who can't reach yet, and you show them 2 kinds of reaching actions? So here they are. And one of these actions has a person reaching and grasping a toy, and the other, the person reaches but just touches the toy and causes it to change state. Now, which do you think 3-month-olds would be better at reasoning about? So thinking about their perceptual and first-hand experience, reaching and grasping actions are very, very common, and even if they can't do them yet, they are working on trying to do this. So it seems like on those grounds, they should be much better at reasoning about the actions on the left. But the empirical finding from our work and other people's work is that they're pretty bad at reasoning about actions like these. So if you run a version of the experiment that I presented in part 1, so a person reaches over a barrier, grasps and lifts the object, and then the barrier goes away, 3-month-old infants don't reliably look longer at the inefficient version of that action. So maybe that's not surprising, because 3-month-olds are not great at a lot of things. But what was surprising, and what we showed in this paper, is that babies succeed when you show them this rarer and simpler action. And we argue that they succeed in the case on the right, because this action conveys a much more abstract feature of action, much more simply. That is a clear cause and effect relation on contact. So for babies who've never successfully reached before, seeing that reaching causes a state change, like this, helps them interpret this action as physically constrained. So if the barrier goes away, infants look longer at the inefficient version of this action than the efficient version of this action. And in fact, this study only works when the person contacts the object and causes it to light up immediately. So if you introduce this very subtle manipulation, that breaks the spatiotemporal continuity of the action, that very subtle manipulation also takes away infants' expectations about efficiency. So when we first found this, it was really, really interesting, but I didn't quite believe this yet. So we found this in one experiment, and then we fully replicated it in a second. So it really looks like infants are, at 3 months, are really tuned into properties of actions that are abstract. That is, whether the action is causing a clear state change in the world, rather than relying on infants' firsthand or perceptual experiences. So in the absence of experience reaching for objects, babies are tuned into abstract features of action beyond just reasoning about what they've seen other people do and what they can do or are trying to do themselves. And this mirrors the other findings I've been telling you about. So instead of thinking about early intuitive psychology as an accumulation of experience, I tend to think about it instead as supported by early emerging concepts like cause and cost and goal, very general properties of agents and actions that allow babies to reason about actions they've never experienced, agents they've never seen, and in fact could guide their own exploration through their own actions, although that last part is a speculation. So in sum, I presented work showing that in the first year of life, infants have systematic knowledge of other people's actions. They interpret other people's actions in terms of continuous abstract variables like cost and reward, coherent plans over those variables, and this understanding goes beyond infant-specific experience. So that's what I worked on from 2014 to 2020. And now I'll tell you a little more about what I'm working on now. So I'm part of a team of researchers who want to understand the origins of common sense in infant minds and brains. So we're developing methods and tools for conducting large-scale studies of infant behavior that can generate the kind of data we need to evaluate computational models. We're also studying the mechanisms of the infant brain that allows them to flexibly learn and reason about so many things, people, places, and things so early in life. And the hope is that these neural and behavioral signals can test and inform formal models of common sense that, like babies, can go from an image or a movie to expectations and intuitions about psychology and physics. And I guess I'll end by saying, I spent 6 years of my PhD studying infant minds, and overall it was absolutely thrilling. There are so many people willing to teach and help me, and I had so many resources at my disposal. But I'll say that it was also really hard at times. Why do I have these opportunities and other people don't? And so what does it mean then to make the most of my time? And what does success look like? So I think the more that we can think of science as done by real people, the more that we can work towards creating spaces and communities where all scientists can thrive as full human beings. So I'll end by thanking the many real people that helped fund and support this work. So my collaborators, funding agencies, the research team, including research assistants and coordinators, the families who participated, my lab communities, and of course, you for your attention.